In this video, we're going to create an inventory tracking system with Excel VBA on our spreadsheet. So what you see here is a preview of what we're going to create today. On this first tab called Input, I have a table that contains different inventory ID numbers for a nail supply company. I have a second field in this table that just shows the description. Over to the left, I have a drop-down menu where I can select any one of these inventory ID numbers. It's going to show the description as well as how much of that inventory is remaining with the weighted average cost and the total value. It also has an area for how much of that inventory has been used, the weighted average cost, and the value. On the second sheet, I have a log or history of all of the purchases that have been made, as well as how much of those purchases have been used. So I have a field for the ID number, the description, the quantity of the purchase, cost per unit, purchase date, how much has been deployed or used, the remaining amount, and then anytime an amount is used, it just shows how much was used and on what date. So if I want to add a new inventory item to this list, all I need to do is select an item, which I'll just select this one. We'll add a quantity of 3,000, cost per unit, and purchase date. Once I click add, what we will see is this get added to the bottom of the list in row 11. So I'll click add. There it is. Now, if I want to use some inventory, what I can do is run this second button. So let's just say we want to use this ID number and we want to use 4,000 units. Well, this line item only has 2,000 units left. So we want to take 2,000 from this line item and then another 2,000 from this line item. So what will happen is this field will get updated, this one, this one, this one, and we'll see notes over here to the side about how much was used. So I'm going to select that same inventory item again. I want to deploy 4,000 units, so I'll click deployment, and now everything gets updated over here showing how much was used. So there's quite a bit to cover, so I'm not going to try and rebuild all of this from scratch. I'm just going to go through what I've already created. So now the first thing you want to do is make sure you save your workbook as a macro-enabled workbook, because we're going to be using VBA to link to these buttons here. The next thing I would recommend is having your unique inventory IDs and the descriptions set up in a table. And this is really not hard to do at all. All you need is your data and headers that are not duplicated. And once you have that, you can simply select that range, hit the keyboard shortcut Control and the letter T. That will automatically create this as a table. And then once you click in that table, you should have this table design ribbon, and you can see your table name, rename it to something other than table 1, because that's the generic table name it gives. So the benefit to having a table is when you link it to the drop-down list here. So if I need to add a new inventory ID number, RF, just call this 3, and maybe this will be 3-inch nails, my drop-down list is automatically going to pick that up. So to add a drop-down list, you want to click in this cell here. Going to go up to data and then data validation. We're going to select list, and in this source we're going to add the indirect function, and then inside the indirect, enclosed in double quotes, we can refer to our table, which my table name is inventory list, and then inside brackets refer to that field inventory ID. This will automatically return all of the values from that field in this table in this drop-down menu. And like I said earlier, it will pick up automatically any new items you want to add. So now the next thing we want to do is just add a simple VLOOKUP formula here that looks at whatever inventory ID number is selected here. Lookup array is our table, and we want to pull back the second column, the description, based on an exact match. So down here we have our remaining inventory quantity, and that is just a simple sum if, where the criteria range is column A of our second tab where the transaction history lives. Our criteria for that criteria column is whatever inventory ID number is selected here, and then the sum range is the remaining column. Similar thing down here, except our sum range is the deployed or used column on our second tab. We then have a weighted average cost per unit, so we want to get the weighted average of the cost per unit based on our weight of how much quantity is remaining, but it's also based on a couple of criteria. One is we have anything in column A that is equal to our lookup value again, and then we have anything in column G that is greater than 0, meaning there's something more than just 0 here, because this is our weight field. So why we need to enclose these each in parentheses and then multiply them by each other is normally these would be true false returns based on these criteria. When you multiply the two by each other, it converts the true falses to ones and zeros, 1 for true, zeros for false. So anytime there's a 1, it multiplies 1 times 1 and calculates that as part of our sum product. And then here are our weight field, which is the quantity, and then the cost per unit field. So we just basically get a 1 times these amounts to capture everything based on our criteria, and then we divide it by our total quantity on hand in this cell above to get a weighted average. So do the same thing down here, except we're looking at the used or deployed column. Then we multiply these two cells by each other to get a total value of these amounts. So now we're ready to begin writing our code for this add purchase button. So we want to get into the VBA editor window. To do that, you can hit Alt F11 or go up to this developer ribbon and click on this Visual Basic button. Now anywhere in this project window, you want to right click, go to Insert, and then Module. I already have one created here, but yours will be blank. And you'll need to begin with the keyword sub for subroutine and give your subroutine a name, hit enter. Once you do that, end sub will automatically populate, and then in between the sub and end sub lines is where you'll put your code. So we begin with variables here, declaring them. So we have WB as a workbook, represents the workbook we're in now. We have variables for each of our two sheets, one for worksheet input, one for worksheet purchases. We have an input range for the values on our input tab that we want to copy over to our second sheet. We have a last row variable that we'll use to get the next available blank row on our second sheet to add new records to. So we have our object variables first. So since they're objects, they need to begin with the keyword set. So we set our workbook equal to this workbook, the one we're in now. We set our worksheet input equal to our workbook, and then worksheets, and that sheet name is input. We set our worksheet purchases equal to our workbook variable, and then the worksheet P and D, which is the name of our second sheet. We set our input range, which is the range we want to copy over the purchase information. So that is going to be our worksheet input, and then the range C4 through C8, because that's what we want to bring over to the second sheet. We have a last row variable, which is going to be the next available blank row where we want to add a new record to. So that is equal to our worksheet purchase and then cells, and the first input of cells is the row input. So for that, we're going to state rows and then count. This counts every single row on the entire sheet all the way down to the very last row at the very bottom. We want this second input to be 1 because we want to begin in column A. We know there's always going to be data there, and from there we want to end Excel up. That's like hitting Control up arrow from the bottom, so it would take us to whatever cell, the last cell that has values in it in column A, and from there we want to get that row number and add 1 to it because we want the row directly below that. So then with our purchases worksheet in the range A, column A, we're going to use the and symbol and join that to our last row variable. So that would be, like right now, that would be row A, cell A12, and then we're going to use another and symbol to join it to the end of our range reference. So we want to populate A through G, so that's why we join that to a colon and G, and then another and symbol to join it to the last row. So that's A12 through G12. We want to set that range equal, and I ran out of space here, so I hit space and underscore to continue this code on a new line. So here we need to use the transpose function. So we use a function in VBA on the worksheet, we need to use application worksheet function and then the function name. I want to transpose our input range variable, which is the input worksheet range C4 through C8, where we input our values. I want to use the transpose function to make this horizontal. Right now it's vertical, so that we can just drop it in here. So that's why we have the transpose function there. And then with our purchases worksheet, we want to populate column F. So we have cells, our last row variable, again, that right now would be row 12, column 6, column F with 0, because we're adding a new purchase in this subroutine. We don't have any deployed quantity yet, so we're just going to populate that with 0. And then the next column over, column 7, we want to set that equal to column 3, which is the original quantity purchase, minus column 6 that we just populated with 0. So that really returns the original quantity again to get, just a remaining amount in column 7. Or column G, and then with the columns we want to auto fit. So we end our with statement, and now we have one more with back on our input worksheet. We have the range C4. We want to set that equal to nothing, so it would be like hitting delete here. We still have our drop down menu, it just clears out these cells here and then the formulas that depend off of it. And then with the range C6 through C10, we just want to clear out any data here because we've added the purchase, we've added it to the second sheet, and at this point we just want to clear everything out for the next transaction. So that is everything for that button. So now we are ready to add our second subroutine to deploy our inventory. So I have a subroutine called deploy inventory. We declare our variables. These first three are exactly the same as the last. We have one for workbook, our 2 worksheets, then we have a range variable for our search value and a range variable for our deployment amount. We then set our workbook and worksheets. We set our search value variable, which is range C4 on the input worksheet. That is just our inventory ID because we need to look that up to get the correct rows on our second sheet. We have our deployment amount variable, which is range C10, which is the quantity of how much inventory we want to deploy. We then have a variable called running total that begins at 0, which is just going to be our running total as we go through row by row based on how much inventory is in each row that we need to use. We have a counter variable called I that's going to represent each row on our second sheet. That begins on row 2 because that's where we want to start our loop. We don't want to start at the header row. We have an if condition at the beginning of our code, and what this does is it looks at the deployment amount in C10 and checks to verify that it is greater than C13, which is the total quantity on hand, because we don't want this code to execute if there's not enough inventory remaining to fill what we need. So it will just simply produce this error message, not enough remaining for this ID number. Our else of this if statement is our do until loop, and this is a loop that just keeps running so long as a condition, or I should say up until a condition is met. So our condition is we want this loop to run until our running total is equal to our deployment amount from this cell here. So we have some variables that we want to set up while this loop is running. The first one is called last column, and similar to the last row, on our second sheet, it's just going to find the last column of whatever row we're on so that we know where to add this note when a deployment is made. So that is equal to cells. This begins on row 2. Really, it's just going to be whatever row we're on during our loop. We want to count all of the columns. That will take us to the last column on the right. From there, we want to end Excel to the left because that's like hitting Control left arrow, and that will get the last column that has values. We want to add 1 to that to get the next available column. We then have a variable called ID, which is equal to our purchases sheet, purchases and deployment, and then cells, whatever row we're on, and then column 1, because we need to know what the ID number is on whatever row we're currently on. This is going to be similar for all these other variables. It's just going to be our second sheet variable followed by cells, and then whatever row we're on beginning at row 2. We want to get the third column to get the quantity amount. So that's the original quantity before the deployment we have previously used, which is going to be equal to row or column 6. So that gets what has already been deployed, and then the remaining, which is the next column over, how much is left before factoring in this current deployment we're on now. So then we have an if condition. If the ID, which is this whatever row we're on ID number, is equal to our search value, which is the ID from the first sheet, input sheet, and the remaining amount for whatever row we're on is not equal to 0, then we want to execute this next if condition, because if this is met, we have two scenarios. One, there's going to be more than enough remaining to fill our deployment needs, or second, there's some remaining but it's not enough, so we're going to have to move on to another row and get more from that next row, assuming the ID matches. So our next if condition, if this condition is met, is if the remaining is greater than or equal to the deployment variable amount minus the running total, which right now in the first iteration of that loop is 0, then we want to set up a variable called used, which is going to be equal to our previously used variable plus deployment minus the running total. So then we set up another variable called remaining, and that is going to be equal to our original minus used, and then we're going to populate column 6 with the amount used variable, the deployment column, and then the remaining amount is going to be placed in column G, or column 7. What we're also going to do is, on whatever row we're on, the last column, we're going to add the quantity. So that is going to be a format function of used minus previously used formatted in number format. And then we're going to use an and symbol to join this. This thing is just not cooperating with me right now. There we go. To join this to a space, and then we're going to use the format of the now function and format that in a date format. So that's just going to populate the quantity and the date in the last column on the right. At this point, we want to set the running total to the current running total plus the absolute value of our used variable minus the previously used. So this could be more or less than this amount, so we really just want to get the difference between the two and add it to the running total, so that's why we had the absolute value. If this condition is not met, then we have our else if condition. If the remaining amount is less than the deployment minus the running total, then we want to create a variable called used, which is remaining plus previously used, and set our remaining variable equal to original minus used, and then we want to populate those same fields like we did up here, column 6 with the used, so that's our deployment amount, and then column 7 or column G with our remaining, and then format the last column in the same way to indicate how much was used and on what date, and then we're going to set our running total the same way we did if this other condition was met, plus the absolute value of used minus previously used. At this point, we want to end our if statements, and then we want to set our counter, increment it to 1 more. So if it started on 2, it's going to be 2 plus 1. That's going to move that counter to row 3. We're going to continue our loop so long as this condition has not been met yet. So it'll keep running until this running total is equal to the deployment, and at that point we'll be outside of our loop. We want to auto fit the columns, and then with our input sheet we want to set that drop down list to blank and clear the contents of our input cells out. So we will go ahead and try and run this. So I'm going to, with this same ID number, we're gonna maybe do 20,000. So we've only got 6,000 left here. We have 10,000 here and 5,000 here. So I'll grab this. We'll add 20,000 and deploy. And now you can see there's nothing left here. It deployed 10,000 here. There's nothing left there. Deployed there 4,000 more than it needed because we had 6,000, 10,000. So that's 16 out of the 20. We needed 4 more. We got it from this 5, and now there's only 1,000 left. Well, that is all for now. Thanks for watching.